Hey guys, it's Evan with Flag Motorsports, and one of the most common questions we get is what the difference is between these Gen 5 LT engines and the Gen 3 and 4 LS engines that we keep going over and we spend so much time with. So on this episode of Teardown Tuesday, I'm going to go through an LT and highlight a lot of the differences that you can obviously see and the ones that you can't so obviously see. So the first thing I want to highlight is that these engines use direct injection, and that bit of technology adds a injector directly into the port opposite of the spark plug. And because of that, we have some really weird things that we're seeing with the pistons and other things that are going to affect the motor. So the first thing is to look at these pistons, and obviously they look completely different from an LS. The most obvious feature is going to be this scoop right in the middle. We call it a sugar scoop, but there's lots of different names for it. Its purpose is as the injector is spraying fuel into it, if you've ever washed a spoon, you'll know that it sprays water everywhere. And so that's the actual desired effect with this scoop, is because the fuel is getting directly injected, it then sprays out and atomizes the air-fuel mixture much better. Continuing on the theme of the pistons, the other thing you'll notice is the exhaust valve relief is on the left side of the piston. That is the opposite of an LS, which would have the exhaust valve relief on the right side of the piston. This is because the LT has the valve locations reversed compared to an LS, so the intake valve and the exhaust valve are flip-flopped. Continuing on with the deck area, we're going to find another few little idiosyncrasies with these. The top left head bolt on only the driver's side bank is going to be different because if it was the same length as the rest, it would crash into the timing area. So it's going to have a weird 13mm inverted hex bolt that goes right here. However, the rest of the head bolts are a different thread than the LS, even though it's the same pattern. The other thing that's different is you'll notice a lack of bolts up at the top that you would see on the LS motors. The other thing that's different is the head dowel locations have moved from these two holes up to these two holes. And the last thing I want to highlight in this area is the lifters. These are DoD lifters, which still suck on the LT, just the same as the Gen 3 and 4 LSs. However, what's also the same is the lifters themselves, the lifter locations, and the trays. Those are all going to be identical between the Gen 3, 4, and 5 motors. All right, I got the front cover off, and obviously there's some stuff missing. This is because the people that we buy our cores from take out the cams. I don't know exactly why, but they do. So obviously we're missing our upper timing sprocket, our chain, some parts like that. The thing that I want to highlight that's going to be the first big difference is all of the covers are glued on with RTV on the LT engines. This is all gray RTV, and the LS engines all have these really nice gaskets, and the LTs moved away from that and went to this RTV, which is a move backwards in my opinion. I don't know exactly why GM did that, but it's kind of frustrating. So what I wanted to talk about here is the technology and difference in this pump. This is what's known as a variable vane pump, and it actually has an electrical connection to the ECU that will control how this pump flows and behaves under different engine loads. So as I take this oil pump off, there's a few different things that we're going to see behind it that are going to be new. The first thing is this electrical connector that does not exist on the LS pump. This is to control that variable pump like I showed you earlier. The next thing is on this timing chain tensioner, there's actually an oil feed that goes to the back of the oil pump. A lot of people will miss this. This is why you can't just switch to an LS2 style timing dampener like the early motors. You would have to plug this in order to do that. The last thing I'll mention back here is that this timing gear is a slip fit on the LT, so if you see yours moving around, that's totally normal on the LT cranks. Up top, we have what's called the Vlom, the valve lifter oil manifold. This is what controls your DOD system. It has 3 connectors up here. One is going to control the VVT solenoid, one is your oil pressure sending unit, and this is a PCV connection. Right here is the mount for your high pressure fuel rail that's going to your fuel injectors. And back here, we have the mount for the high pressure lift pump. This pump is fed from the electric fuel pump in the tank, and it is powered by the camshaft. It's a mechanical pump that takes your fuel pressure and ramps it up to several thousand PSI to feed those direct injection injectors. Easy as pie.
I'm putting that in there.
That gasket was a little stuck, but here's a look at underneath.
Yeah.
This next piece that we see once the Vlom is off is the lifter for that high pressure fuel pump I was talking about. And there it goes. And it looks just like a lifter, but it has its own lobe on the cam for just the high pressure fuel pump. Now looking at the side of the block, we're going to go ahead and get these knock sensor shields out of the way. To talk about the side of the block, I want to focus on the motor mount hole location. It may look the same as an LS, but this is a different pattern, so you will need different motor mounts to take advantage of this block, even though the bell housing bolt pattern is the same. The starter location and bolt pattern is the same as the LS motors. The crank sensor is in the same spot, but it's a unique sensor for these motors, even though it uses a standard 58X reluctor wheel like you would see on a Gen 4 LS. You'll also notice that the forward mounted air conditioning provision is gone from the LT engine. Taking a look at the driver's side of the block, we've got the same motor mount pattern as the passenger side, but it's also going to be different than the LS. And we'll see here the vacuum pump provision. This is only used on trucks. Passenger cars have this plugged. This is an oil feed hole, and this is an oil return hole. This goes down to the crankcase, as you can see my glove moving right here. So this drains right back into the pan. So make sure if you're doing a swap and you got this from a truck that these two are either plugged or used for like a turbo feed and turbo drain or something of that nature. The last thing I'd like to highlight on the side of the block is this really helpful ID tag. It is just a sticker, so sometimes it'll be gone, but this one says right here that it was an L83, which is a earlier Gen 5 5.3 liter that came in trucks and vans, and it should tell you some stuff about your engine. This will be the most relevant code that you're going to be looking for. This will say LT1, LT4, L86, or whatever you may have. The next thing we're going to notice on the back of the block is that this crank has an 8-bolt pattern, like the earlier LSA engines. This is going to differ from the 6-bolt pattern that's on the typical LS crank. And like I said, all the covers are going to be RTV'd on, so you'll definitely need a little bit of prying to get this cover off after all the bolts are out. And you can take a look and see all this extra RTV that I was talking about earlier that can cause problems. I really am not a big fan of this design. Here is one of the only gaskets in the motor. This is used to seal off the rear oil galleys. Dang, that is a brand new bearing. I'm going to show the camera. Very, very, very nice. Now, I'm seeing a lot of carbon buildup on these rings here. So all of these bearings are looking basically mint condition, to the point where we jokingly say we could reuse these. Now, bearings are cheap enough that it's never warrant to reuse them, but that's a really good sign that your motor is healthy. If the bearings coming out of it look so good that you almost feel like you could reuse them. The other thing I'm noticing is that these pistons are in really good condition also. However, they're a little bit caked up with carbon, and that's going to be one of the downsides of the LT series of engines. We're going to see a lot more carbon buildup, and that's due to the nature of a direct injection motor. They inherently will build up a lot more deposits and carbon, especially on the valves. One of the other things that we're going to notice about the LT engine that's going to be different is the location of the connecting rod bearing tang. That little tang is the same as an LS and all the other small block Chevys, except it's in a different location on the LT. So the rod journal's the same, all those parts are the same, the connecting rods are largely the same except for that tang location. So that can catch you up if you are trying to buy connecting rod bearings. You need to make sure that they match whichever connecting rods you're using. So this looks to be a fairly low mile engine. If I had to guess, this is most likely low 100,000 mile range, between maybe 100,000 and 150,000. It looks like they did a pretty fair job at their oil changes. I don't see any egregious oil deposits, but it definitely has some staining. All right, and before I take the crank out, I always like to give it a spin, and this one feels really, really good. So to continue on with some of our differences, if you look, I've got the number 3 main cap here, which typically has our thrust bearing. And while the lower has the thrust bearing, the upper does not, and that is how the LT comes from the factory. I'm not exactly sure why they decided to only use 1/2 thrust bearing, but it seems to work okay on most stock applications. When we're doing these for an aftermarket build, typically we'll upgrade that to a full thrust bearing. However, they use a 3-piece lower thrust bearing, which is a big upgrade over the stock formed ones that you'll find in the earlier motors. A lot of really high-end bearings like Dido will use this style thrust bearing with a lot of success. Also, you'll notice the main bearings are this orange color. They come coated from the factory. The other thing that's really going to set the LT apart is these things down here, if you look near the cam tunnel. These are the oil squirters. Those send pressurized oil to the base of the piston to help cool the piston. It's, in my opinion, one of the best features these engines have, and something really, really cool that we love to retain on some of our road race engines and things of that nature, because it's really, really helpful, especially in a dry sump where you're not getting as much splash lubrication for the bottoms of the pistons. These oil squirters step up and really do a great job. They also really help in supercharged applications. And to be frank, this is one of the nicest cores I've taken apart. There is virtually zero wear on any of the bearings. The lifters looked really good. The skirts of the pistons looked fantastic, and all of the cross-hatching looks pretty solid on this engine. So I don't see any real issues with it. It's going to be a really, really solid foundation for us to build on. We will most likely end up sleeving this block and building a larger cubic inch one. However, it's really nice to start with such a fresh core. Well, we got this LT torn down. While we didn't find anything really wrong with it, I hope that it was a really good informational video for you guys to kind of go over some of the internal short block differences on the LT. Next time we get a long block LT, which hopefully will be pretty soon, spoiler alert, we'll have a lot more opportunity to go through some of the other nuances in cylinder heads, the top end, the accessory drive, because all those things are going to be very different as well. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you watched it this far, I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions for us on the LT, any differences with the LT, anything of that nature, feel free to leave a comment. And yeah, thanks again.